As far back as I can remember, Christmas has always been a special event in my family. Every year, our home transformed into a true festive center. We lived on the second floor of an old two-story house that my father had inherited. The ground floor was rented out to tenants, and often the people living there would become part of our Christmas celebrations. But in 2013, everything changed. At that time, we had a new tenant. Her name was Claire, a woman in her 30s who had moved into the downstairs apartment just before the holidays. She seemed calm and polite, the type of person my parents would have liked to have as a neighbor. However, right from the start, something felt wrong. We began hearing strange noises at night. It wasn't just the usual sounds of an old house, doors closing, furniture being moved, but also something more disturbing, like whispers and soft giggling that echoed through the walls. At first, I thought it might be my imagination, but the noises kept happening. My father, suspicious, decided he would speak with Claire. The night before Christmas, he went downstairs to clear things up, but when he returned, he seemed tense and didn't want to go into detail about the conversation. He didn't seem convinced that Claire was being entirely honest. We decided to ignore the events and go ahead with the Christmas dinner since the whole family was gathered. Christmas night arrived, and our house was filled with laughter and conversation. My mother had prepared a feast and everyone was enjoying themselves, but for me, something felt out of place. The sense of unease wouldn't go away, and the noises from downstairs seemed to grow more intense. My father, still concerned, went outside to smoke several times throughout the evening. When he was outside, I noticed something strange. The back door was open, which was unusual because my mother always made sure to lock it at night. My instincts began to warn me, but I ignored it, thinking it was just the exhaustion and mix of emotions from the night. The dinner was winding down and everyone was getting ready for the gift exchange when suddenly, a bright light flashed through the front window. I went to the window to see what was happening, and what I saw made my blood run cold. Claire was standing outside in the garden with a vacant look fixed on our window. It didn't look like she was staring at anything in particular, but it seemed as if she was watching. I decided to go to the front door and see if she needed anything, but before I could open it, I heard quick footsteps coming up the stairs. Someone was coming up. I froze, trying to figure out whether it was my father or someone else. Suddenly, the front door opened. I froze as I saw Claire, now inside our house, with a strange smile and an expression I couldn't understand. She was just there, silently, not saying a word. My father, who had just returned from outside, saw Claire and in a firm tone, told her to leave. Claire seemed to not hear him. She walked into the living room, heading directly for the Christmas tree, where she began tampering with the presents. The tension in the room was palpable, and everyone was uncomfortable with the situation. My mother tried asking Claire to leave, but the woman seemed unfazed, as if in a trance. That's when we heard something we would never forget. A sound like a quiet laugh, coming from downstairs from Claire's apartment door. The laugh wasn't Claire's. It was a low, malicious male laugh, one that froze us all in fear. My father quickly went to the downstairs door and, with a serious expression, knocked loudly, demanding that the man inside come out immediately. When there was no answer, he prepared to break down the door. That's when the tenant appeared, calmly walking up the stairs. He was a man in his 40s with a cold, distant look. He simply looked at us without saying a word and walked past. Claire seemed indifferent to everything. She just turned to us with that strange smile and disappeared up the stairs, following the man. I didn't know what to do. Everything was happening so quickly that I could barely process it. The man who had come out of the downstairs apartment walked past us without a word, and Claire, with that strange smile on her face, simply vanished up the stairs. The sound of her footsteps echoed through the house like an omen of something even more sinister. My father, who was beside me, no longer seemed calm. He looked at me with a determined expression and gestured for us to move away from the stairs. We all went into the living room and he locked the door behind us, as if that simple action could ward off any threat. But I knew it wouldn't be that simple. The laugh we had heard from downstairs was still in my head, like a bothersome echo. It was a low, almost whispered laugh, but with such a malicious tone that it made my stomach turn. Suddenly, the sound of firm footsteps on the stairs alerted us again. I froze. It wasn't my father. I knew it wasn't. My father made a quick gesture for everyone to move away from the living room door. He looked at my mother, who seemed pale, and said, "Stay here. I'll go downstairs to see what's happening." But before he could move, the front door slammed open with a loud bang. I jumped, and my eyes locked on the silhouette of a person standing in the doorway. Fear consumed me. What more could happen? The figure seemed vaguely familiar, but their face was covered by a dark mask, almost as if they were disguised. And before I could scream or make any move, the person leaned forward, revealing a smile. The same smile Claire had, but this time it was more sinister, wider. "We're all here, aren't we?" said the voice, hoarse and dripping with irony. I could almost feel the tension in the air, fear spreading like a massive wave. My father moved forward, shouting for the person to leave immediately, but before he could reach the door, it slammed shut. The house fell into complete silence for a moment. Then what seemed like a nightmare turned into something even stranger. Suddenly, the light in the living room flickered. I looked at the others and realized we were all standing, tense, not knowing what to do. Then, without warning, the voice sounded again, but now it was clearer, as if coming from somewhere in the house. "You don't know what's behind that door. You never knew. You never will." My father, now visibly worried, rushed to the entrance hall, trying to open the front door. But when he pushed it, it didn't give. It was locked from the inside. He looked at the others with wide eyes, and that's when I noticed the even greater tension on his face. He was afraid. My father had never been afraid of anything. "Something is very wrong," he said, his voice trembling. "I'll have to go downstairs." But before he could descend, we heard a sound coming from the garden. A repeated, persistent banging. The sound of something heavy being thrown against the window. My mother rushed to the living room window, and when she looked outside, her face turned as white as a sheet of paper. It wasn't Claire nor the man. There were several shadows moving in the snow, dragging something heavy into the bush. Without wasting a moment, my father rushed to the back door, but before he could open it, a voice whispered from behind him, almost at his ear, "You won't be leaving here so easily." He froze, and then, as if an invisible thread was pulling him, he was dragged backward, falling to the ground with a muffled scream. I ran to him, but the figure holding him was already disappearing into the darkness of the hallway. Fear now gripped all of us. We knew we were no longer alone. Suddenly, the front door opened again, but this time no one was outside. It was an open entrance to the cold night. And as I looked to the side, something in the hallway made me stop. Claire's mask was hanging on the wall, on the door, as if someone had intentionally left it there. With my heart racing, I approached the mask. When I touched it, a cold shiver ran down my spine. The mask felt too real, in an almost organic way. I looked back and saw my father standing at the bottom of the stairs, his eyes wide and fixed on something in the living room. Something I couldn't yet see. He took a step back, but as I watched him, I noticed something deeper in his expression. He was no longer alone. The hooded figure was behind him, standing silently, eyes locked on me. Suddenly my father turned, but it was no longer him. The person he had become no longer had humanity in their eyes. He simply moved away like a puppet without strings. And the worst part? He looked at me one last time and, with a smile, said, "Now we're all part of this." At that moment, the front door slammed shut, and the atmosphere turned cold. The only sound that remained was the sound of footsteps slowly retreating, echoing in the silence of the house. I was left in shock, completely speechless. I had witnessed something impossible to understand, something beyond the limits of what could be explained. Whatever was behind that mask, behind that door, it was still waiting for me. And I knew the answer was somewhere, but did I really want to find it? I stood frozen, immersed in a swirl of thoughts and emotions. What was happening? Who was that thing that had taken my father? And what exactly was this thing behind Claire's mask? I felt a knot in my stomach, a sense that everything I had once believed to be normal, safe, and understandable was unraveling before my eyes. The house was now silent, except for the sound of the snow hitting the windows and the distant sound of someone moving downstairs. I knew I couldn't stay there any longer, but at the same time, something compelled me to not leave, as if the answer was closer than I imagined. Claire's mask was still hanging on the door, swaying lightly as if it had a life of its own. I approached it, hesitantly, and without knowing why, placed my hand on it. The moment my finger touched the fabric, a wave of heat coursed through my body, and a voice whispered, low and distorted, in my mind, "You know what you need to do." I didn't know what the voice meant, but as I looked back, the fear that something much worse was about to happen took hold of me completely. I decided to act. With the mask in my hands, I made my way downstairs, determined to face whatever was waiting for me. Each step felt heavier, the air denser, as if the house itself was swallowing me whole. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, a sense of urgency washed over me. Something was wrong. Something was already waiting for me down there. The attic door was slightly ajar, a faint sliver of light emanating from within, as if something was watching, waiting. I hesitated for a second, but there was no turning back. Curiosity mixed with fear pushed me toward the door. The moment I entered, a muffled scream cut through the air. My father, or what was left of him. He was standing in the center of the attic, in an unnatural position, as if controlled by some invisible force. His eyes were completely empty, lifeless. Claire's mask was now on his face, as if he had become it, or as if he were simply waiting for me to put it on. "Now you're part of this too," he whispered in a voice that was no longer his. Suddenly the house trembled. An invisible force seemed to invade every corner. The air became thick and heavy. Something ancient, something far more powerful than any of us had ever imagined, was awakening there. The mask, the house, everything was part of something much bigger than I could understand. Before I could react, I felt a cold hand grab my wrist. I looked to the side and saw Claire, now standing next to me, with the same sinister smile I had seen before. She was no longer human, her eyes glowing with a supernatural intensity. "Are you ready to know the truth?" she asked as the sound of distorted whispers and echoes of laughter filled the air around us. I didn't know how to answer. I didn't know what was happening. But before I could process anything, the house began to collapse around us, as if everything had been prepared to swallow us whole. A vast darkness consumed the space, and the last thing I heard before everything fell silent was the sound of something breaking in two, like a final scream. And then, complete silence. I woke up in a strange room, cold and damp, with the walls covered in dense fog. It wasn't the house. It wasn't my world. I was somewhere else now. The air was heavy, and the shadows around me seemed to move as if waiting to speak to me. "Welcome to your true home," a voice echoed, familiar but impossible to identify. I looked toward the source of the voice, but all I saw was the silhouette of a figure, holding Claire's mask in their hands. It was time to find out what was really happening. Whatever it was, the game was only beginning. And I didn't know if I would ever escape. The end? Or perhaps just the beginning.